Hey, good afternoon. Great to have you all with us. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome Beong-Soo Kim, President of the University of Southern California, for this conversation about reclaiming the research university. Beong took the helm of USC last year after serving as university's general counsel and senior vice president. Before USC, his roles included serving in the U.S. Department of Justice, where he led the major frauds section in Los Angeles. He became president at a turbulent time for America's research universities. There's declining trust in institutions. 7 in 10 Americans, according to some polls, say that higher ed is headed in the wrong direction. There's campus protests, concerns about politicized curriculum, and sustained pressure from Washington. Today we're going to talk about some of those dynamics, what it takes for university leaders to remake their institutions, to promote robust discourse and free inquiry, and Beong's vision for USC. Those watching at home, if they have questions, can share them with us via X or Twitter at #AEI Hess Kim. Yeah, thanks for joining us today, man.
Thanks, Rick. Great to see you.
What possessed you to want to become a university president in 2025?
It's a great question. And the answer is that contrary to what a lot of people might think about being a university leader right now, I actually don't think that there's been a better time to have an impact. And yes, universities, higher education have been going through a period of great volatility. And I think that all of those ups and downs are opportunities for universities like USC to rethink and reground ourselves in our mission and figure out how we can update our model, reinforce the great things that we do, re-examine things that we could do differently. And I'm incredibly energized by all the opportunities that I see, frankly, to do that at USC.
And I'm sure we'll get to Washington and public policy, but it'd be nice, I think, just to start by talking about what campus leaders can do and how you see the challenge. First off, one of the conversations we've been having a lot over the last couple of years is concerns by people like me and many of my colleagues that campuses have lost their way when it comes to free inquiry, that research institutions are not homes of robust discourse or places where scholars are asking all kinds of hard questions, but where there's a heavy thumb on the scale. Curious about what you make of those concerns and how you're thinking about it.
So I obviously know USC the best. And what I would say is that USC has long been and continues to be a place where there is robust debate, robust differences of opinion, engagement with those differences, and we can do better. And I've been focusing really on how to do better. And part of the answer certainly is around rules and policies and all of those things which are important. Those kind of determine the framework in which a debate and discussion can occur. But I think the real challenge and the real opportunity lie in how you cultivate a culture of academic debate, differences of opinion, engagement with those differences. And it's an incredibly energizing challenge to me. I think it involves, of course, leadership and leadership vision, not just by me, but by the deans, by the provost. But it also requires, I think, if you're going to really move the needle, it requires cultural buy-in by the faculty, by the students, to want to really sustain and reinforce that kind of culture.
So what are some of the steps you're taking to try to make that happen?
Well, so from my vantage point, one of the first things I did was to create this open dialogue initiative where I'm talking about it. I'm talking about it all the time, Rick. I talked about it at convocation when I welcome new students. I talk about it when I speak with the faculty, when I speak with parents. So I talk about it a lot because I want other people to talk about it, and I think that's happening. To lead this open dialogue initiative that we have at USC, I gave some thought to who I wanted to help me lead it. And I decided that it should be a faculty member, because it could have been another administrator, it could have been someone else. But I thought that having a faculty member lead it would be important in terms of just signaling that this is something that's really important. And it's not just a student challenge, there's a faculty opportunity as well. And so the professor I chose was someone named Neeraj Sood, who is a renowned health expert, public policy expert in our Price School. And for him, this issue of academic freedom and open discourse is very personal, because he was conducting research during the pandemic that he was fearful was going to result in his getting canceled. And it had to do with the infection rate of COVID cases. And USC supported that research, but he, I think, came away from that research and from the experience with a greater appreciation of the fragility of academic freedom and open discourse. And he's super charged up about leading this initiative. But it takes much more than just the president and a faculty member. He's been going around to the campus. We've been sponsoring events. We may talk about it later, but when we received the Compact for Higher Education, he actually came to me and said, what if we do a panel discussion? This was after I had sent my response back. And he put together a panel, and they debated it. We've since done another panel on mandatory testing. I think he's going to do one on grade inflation. And the idea is to really model respectful, rational disagreement and discourse. And then we have resources for faculty to help them take on difficult subjects in their courses. How do you do that in a way that's pedagogically effective? And I think that there's excitement around that. And then we have these opportunities that we give to faculty and students to come up with their own ideas for how to move the culture work forward around open dialogue. And so they can apply for these small grants to help fund their ideas. And we have a student advisory committee that is really trying to really model and create that kind of culture that we believe we have, but that could be stronger.
You know, one of the, I think, inevitable tensions here is, love what you said, this sounds great, but I look at the data on faculty composition, and we see that, you know, it leans heavily to the left in general. In the fields with which I'm acquainted, so say education policy, or when we look at criminology, we see that most major universities seem to have a very strong lean in terms of the locus of courses. So you say we've got a robust, healthy discourse of faculty, and we can do better. Can you do better in terms of attracting scholars with different lines of inquiry and reflecting different traditions of thought? And if so, how do you as a leader try to nudge the university in that direction?
So I think it's a really important topic, and at the same time, how you approach it is really important, and it can't be done in a ham-fisted kind of manner. I think that part of it is going to be addressed by the work that I just described. When I talk about the kind of culture that we want to be creating, sure, it's a culture of open dialogue and academic freedom, but ultimately, Rick, the way that I see it is that what we're really after is academic excellence. I don't think you can have academic excellence if you don't have people with different perspectives and viewpoints tackling problems. So I don't think that the solution lies in taking some kind of Noah's Ark type approach where, okay, if we have someone of this point of view, we need someone of that point of view. these fields are way too complex to take such a simplistic approach. But I think that if we can really reinforce this culture where students and faculty members truly understand the value of having someone in their field who actually comes at the subject from a very different perspective, that's a plus. That's going to create a more robust intellectual environment, and it's ultimately going to produce better teaching, and it's going to produce better research. And so that's really how we're approaching it. And the other thing I'll say is that this is where the academic leaders of the university really need to buy in. I can stand up and talk as much as I want about these subjects, but if the academic leadership is not buying in, and then the department chairs and so on and so forth, if they're not buying in, nothing's gonna really change. But I think that if the leadership is aligned, which the USC leadership is, then you can really make some progress over time.
Any thoughts on how institutions can get that kind of buy-in that you're describing?
Well, I think that, of course, academic leaders don't just elect themselves; they're chosen. So I think there's always opportunities for an institution to make sure that you have that kind of philosophical alignment and around a vision, and then I think it's really kind of talking and showing the proof of concept, showing the way that when you hit problems from very different perspectives, you can really produce some magic. We see it in research all the time. We have hundreds of researchers from different fields, different schools, different departments, focusing on Alzheimer's, for example, and all of them bring their own great perspectives. But I think that when we're talking about teaching, I think there are real opportunities to share better than we do different kind of teaching approaches. And I don't have all the answers, Rick. You probably do. But instead of having just one professor teach a certain subject that's kind of controversial, if that professor doesn't feel that they can adequately represent another point of view on this contentious subject, bring in someone else, co-teaching. There are so many things like that. I think there maybe even be opportunities to use AI to help make sure that you're providing an educational experience that ultimately is not trying to indoctrinate or teach one particular perspective, but teaching students how to think for themselves critically about that subject.
So on a different but related note, a huge issue has been questions of rigor. And you mentioned this pursuit of excellence. Just down the coast a little bit, the University of California at San Diego recently had this internal report when it turned out that huge numbers of admitted students can't do elementary school mathematics. There have been questions about how limits on foreign enrollment are affected. Talk us through a little bit about how you're thinking about these challenges in terms of establishing and bolstering a culture of academic excellence in terms of teaching and learning.
Yeah, I love the way you frame this in terms of rigor, because I do think that that's really what we're after, and it's so connected to the goal of academic excellence. As you mentioned, we have, I think, a serious K through 12 challenge with the way that, at least in California, what we're seeing in terms of preparedness in math in particular, and at USC, we're seeing some of that. I don't think it's as pronounced as what you've seen maybe at some other universities, but it's a challenge, and we're trying to address it. So there's that set of issues, and of course, universities can offer all sorts of access programs, and we have the Neighborhood Academic Initiative, which does an amazing job bringing local students in at the 6th grade to come in over the weekend to take supplemental classes, and they come to USC throughout the week, and those programs are great. But it's hard for universities to really kind of address that by themselves. And then once they get to university, the question is how do we make sure, and I'm going to say particularly in the humanities where it may be a little bit more of a challenge, how do we make sure that we are maintaining academic rigor in terms of grading and things like that? I think that there are so many powerful incentives, unfortunately nowadays, for professors just to grade more easily. That's the key to getting a good evaluation from a student. So we absolutely need to rethink, if not how we do student evaluations of professors, but what kind of weight we place on those student evaluations. And I think it may be the case, Rick, that we need to kind of look elsewhere, outside the grading paradigm, in order to better assess and monitor academic rigor to make sure that we're maintaining it. Here's just an example, and I haven't heard other people talk about this, so it may be a terrible idea, but I think that it's not going to be difficult in the future for us to figure out ways to convey a student's skills and rigor and preparedness that goes beyond just their transcript. I think you have blockchain diplomas, you have opportunities, I think, to be able to not just say this student has a 3.8 GPA, but these are the projects that they worked on. And here's what the projects actually look like. And here are the skills that they developed in all these different classes. I'm really excited about that. And I think that that might be a way of kind of sidestepping all of the kind of difficult structural challenges in terms of reforming grading and coming up with a more qualitative and meaningful way of assessing and conveying to employers and to others what kind of rigor a student had in terms of their academic courses and performance.
You know, we're used to thinking, I think, we're used to thinking of very selective elite research institutions like USC, like its peers, I think as places where students kind of expect to work hard. But what we've seen over the last several years, especially post-pandemic, The Atlantic, which I don't think is anybody's notion of a right-wing rag, has done some long pieces on this, that expectations of student work, even at elite institutions, seem to have declined precipitously. Students talk about being expected to read 30 or 40 pages a week for a class as an unreasonable burden. Students don't do that much writing. We know when Harvard tried to address grade inflation a couple months back, there were stories of students in tears. You know, when this culture, I think, is a reality at a lot of institutions. How do we start to turn the tide in pursuit of rigor?
Yeah, there's a real chicken and egg problem here, I think. Let's just stipulate that students are coming to college less prepared than they were in the past, with shorter attention spans, with less ability to do math and to do the kind of amount of reading that was previously required. So then you're a university, do you just enforce or apply the exact same academic standards that were in place 20 years ago? Or do you adapt to where the students are? And then if you're adapting to where the students are you not on a slippery slope then to just less rigor? So it's a real dilemma. And I think that the first thing we have to do is we just have to talk very openly about this subject. And it's complex. I was speaking with Jonathan Haidt a few months ago, and of course, he's well known for his recent book, The Anxious Generation, which talks about the way that adolescent minds.
And he's a parent of one of your students, I believe.
Yes,
right?
He's a very proud USC parent whose son is at USC. But he was talking to me about the fact that we have this epidemic of sorts with adolescent development having really been hampered by social media, by the use of cell phones. And that's the focus of the book. But those problems don't go away once they reach college. We're dealing with them. And it's very much related, I think, to some of the challenges that our professors are experiencing. And so we got to talk about it. We got to study it. And we've got to figure out a way that we can, yes, meet students where they are, but make sure that they are still prepared and that we are still expecting the same amount of rigor that they're going to need to compete in this global marketplace.
One of the challenges is that teens and 20-some spend an extraordinary amount of time, obviously, on devices, social media gaming, 6, 8, 9 hours a day, depending on the population. In K-12, one of the ways middle schools, high schools are trying to combat some of this, obviously, is cell phone bans. How do you think about devices, social media, gaming, in terms of that culture of academic excellence? Anything the institution can do?
I think so. I think it starts with being very intentional. There are so many different types of classes. There are some classes where it might make sense for the students to be prompt engineering together and talking about what kind of responses they're getting from ChatGPT or some other LLM, and that's great. There are other classes where, rightfully so, those aids should not be allowed whatsoever, whether in the classroom or in the dorm room. We've even seen some professors who not only insist that students close their laptops because of all the distractions on those laptops during the class, but they actually don't even allow note-taking because they're trying to encourage students to actually look at each other when they're speaking and make eye contact and listen to what other people are saying without the distraction of any kind of electronic device. I'm not saying that any of those are the perfect solution, but they all come out of some intention about what the professor is trying to do. And I think we need to just be much more intentional about how we're expecting students to use AI. Now, even though I'm not an expert in the first part of your question, I really think that there's a different balance of interest at the middle school and high school levels where it's much easier to understand just flat bans on a lot of ChatGPT and LLMs because of the high risk that instead of being used as aids or tutors, they're going to be used as substitutes for writing and for critical thinking.
So let's talk a bit about AI in general in terms of, as you all are thinking about what it means for your curriculum, for teaching, for expectations. It's obviously early days for everybody. Folks are wrestling with this. Curious if you have a sense of the right way to figure out your path forward, if you have taken any first steps as far as formal AI policies?
Yeah. So one of the first things that I did as president was I created an AI strategy committee that is led by the dean of our business school, Jeff Garrett, and is comprised of experts across the university, from the Rossier School of Education to the Viterbi School and everything in between, to really kind of think about how AI is disrupting the educational model and what are the opportunities for USC to lead in this area. And so I'm hesitant to get ahead of that committee because they haven't presented their recommendations to me yet. That's going to take place in the next couple months. But some initial thoughts or ideas that I have, of course, AI is transforming society. the extent to which it's going to do so is open for debate. No one knows the extent to which it's going to change the job market, eliminate jobs. We clearly, though, have got to be ready for a variety of scenarios. And one of the things I think that is likely to come out of this committee is a recommendation around encouraging or requiring some form of AI literacy that's relevant to the particular domain of that student, whether he or she is a historian, a dancer, a musician, or a biologist. It's going to look different, but there's no question that it's going to be relevant and important for students to understand in all of those different disciplines. And at the same time, I think that this may be a moment when we need to think about the importance of the liberal arts and the humanities. When you query ChatGPT a question, it gives you an answer, and it looks like, well, this is the answer. And we all know that once you enter the workforce, as you go through your lives, there really aren't very many easy answers to any questions that are worth asking. And so how do you teach students what are the right questions to ask? How do you interpret ambiguous texts that actually don't have one single answer? And how do you work with other humans on these really difficult problems that aren't just technical, but that also have a really significant human development element? And I think that that's something that the humanities taught well can do. So I'm excited to see what the committee comes back with, but those are some of my thoughts.
I like it. So let's shift gears a little bit. Another pressure that, because what we're talking about's not enough so far. Another pressure you're wrestling with, obviously, is the financial situation that colleges are wrestling with. There's demographic questions. There's changes in federal grants. There's questions about endowment taxes. I believe you guys are under the threshold for the per capita. What kind of financial situation is USC in? And given that you guys have very pricey tuition, and you've indicated previously you'd like to address that, how do you start thinking about the cost model, and where are there opportunities?
Right. So USC has been really in the same waters as a lot of other major research universities in terms of dealing with uncertainty around federal research funding, indirect cost reimbursement, international student enrollment, and the list goes on. And at the same time, I think that we've also had to deal with structural deficits and had to make some really difficult decisions this last semester around workforce reductions, layoffs, and those were really hard. But
Can you talk a bit about what you did?
Sure. Well, the first thing I did is I really tried to get out there and talk to as many members of the community, faculty, staff, and everyone, students also, about the situation we were in and the need to address it quickly. Because if we didn't address these challenges and prepare ourselves and develop a more resilient operating model, it wasn't going to get better. It was just going to get more challenging, and we'd have to take more serious actions down the road. And I was blown away, Rick, by the level of understanding and the desire of the community to lean in and help. We had a kind of an idea box that people could submit anonymous ideas to, and we got hundreds and hundreds of recommendations, many of which we then implemented. And so we were able to really deal with a pretty significant challenge and create a more resiliency in our operating model in an incredibly short period of time. And I give so much credit to the USC community, the staff and the faculty, and the academic leaders and the unit leaders who just showed incredible leadership in getting it done in a way that was open, engaging, transparent, and effective. Now, we're not out of the woods yet. There's a lot more.
So what are some of the steps you actually wound up taking?
Well, we put in place certain expense controls, travel controls. Some of those are going to be eased up on now that we've addressed the most serious financial issues that we had. And then we did have to lay off a number of individuals, staff, non-tenured track faculty, and it was really difficult. But we really tried as hard as we could to prioritize the academic mission. And that's really the answer to the second part of your question, which is how do you deal with the fact that there are more financial challenges on the horizon, whether it's the One Big Beautiful Bill or international student uncertainty. And the answer, of course, we have the usual levers, whether it's making sure that our endowment continues to grow and making sure that our philanthropy is continuing, which that's been going really well. But even beyond those usual levers, we've got to focus. We've got to make sure that we're not doing things that are really far from the academic mission. And so what this means is maybe if we have 20 centers focused on AI or something else, we should ask ourselves, do we need that many? And can you actually have a greater research impact by combining some of them, subject to the faculty agreeing and all that. So there are opportunities like that. We also have a giant health system that we're incredibly proud of, that does amazing work, that helps fuel the medical research that we're doing on our health sciences campus. And we've had to do belt tightening there. And again, focusing on what are the specialties, what are the disciplines where we want to really excel.
Two macro trends that cut across all the disciplines that have caught a lot of attention at a place like AEI are one, growth in administrative ranks at especially research universities, and a second is the steady decline of faculty teaching, which is partly why the ranks of adjuncts have grown over time. How have you thought about that? Have either administrative staffing or faculty teaching been a part to date of your efforts on this?
I'd say that we're still working through those issues, and I'm really excited about doing it, actually. So in terms of, the premise of a research university, and why I think many students choose them over a smaller liberal arts college where you get maybe smaller classes and more attention, is that you do get to learn from these researchers who are at the forefront of their fields, doing things that ChatGPT doesn't know about and isn't going to be able to tell you about. And I think that that's the premise, that's the promise. And I mentioned earlier that I think that there are opportunities to make sure that within that model, teaching is still being prioritized. And it can be a little bit of a challenge because, frankly, at a major research university like USC, academic greatness is usually thought of in terms of research productivity and journal publications and all sorts of indices showing how much you've been cited and all these important measures. Not so much in terms of teaching, but I actually think there are opportunities, and I'm excited to pursue these opportunities with the faculty to create more opportunities for our great research professors to also teach more and to have the time to update their syllabi and think about how they can incorporate AI or not incorporate AI into their classes. So I think that's kind of to be determined, but it's something that I want to really focus on, because when I think about what are the reasons why a USC exists, ultimately it comes down to we want to provide the very best educational value that we can. And that means great teaching. And we also want to do life-changing research and innovation. And I really think that we can do both, but it takes a lot of effort. And again, with respect to the financial actions that we had to take, the reason why the experience, I think, is actually was almost a healthy experience. It didn't feel like that at all. It's still, we still have the wounds from the experience, but I think it's healthy in the sense that it really focused us on the question, what is essential to our core academic mission and what is not essential to that core academic mission? How do we really focus on the former?
And as far as the administrative staffing, I mean, obviously there's been a steady trend up over time,
Yeah.
especially at large research institutions. Are there opportunities there to take a fresh look at some of the money that's going into administration?
I think there are. And I think that the opportunities that are most exciting are the ones where we can actually improve our impact by doing more with less. And I think there might be opportunities as a result of the financial work that we had to do to think about how do we improve or rethink our advising. There might be opportunities to think about admissions and how we do admissions. Do college admissions essays still make sense nowadays when so many students, I imagine, are using an LLM to help them generate ideas or generate the first drafts or even the final drafts of their admissions essays? So I think that there might be some real opportunities to just kind of acknowledge what's out there already in terms of the changes that are occurring.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a big change from when 30% of them reported their parents were writing their essays.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, that was about 4 years ago. They did a survey of 1,000 students at selective colleges. 30% reported that their parents had written their, right, which is always I'm curious, what are your personal feelings on admissions testing?
Well, on admissions testing, we're in a curious place being in California. So the UC systems are actually test blind. And so what that means is if you got 1,600 on the SAT, they don't consider that at all. And I know that there's a few, not just a few, but a number of universities that have been moving back to mandatory testing. We're looking at the issue, but one of the concerns that we have is there are a lot of students who might just be applying to the UCs or Cal States and USC. And that won't be an option if they're being advised in their high schools, oh, you don't need to take the SAT or the ACT. So we're a little bit worried about some of those impacts. I have to say that in addition, when I think you talk to, and I think it probably varies by university, but I think that our admissions professionals don't feel that it has hindered them in any significant way from being able to assess academic readiness for our demanding program. And they still would say that the GPA is still a much more important indicator. I will say, though, that one of the things I think all universities need to think about is this issue we talked about earlier, which is math preparedness. And that's one area where I think that SAT and ACT testing is helpful. If that student wants to go into engineering, wants to go into the hard sciences, that might be helpful. And so we're weighing a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, obviously part of the challenge when admissions professionals say we got this is we've seen massive grade inflation in K-12. We now have 90% of students get an A or a B in core subjects, even though 90% of students are not regularly in school with chronic absenteeism.
So the grade inflation is taking place at the K through 12 levels?
Is massive. And I guess the question is, a guy like me who doesn't actually have to do anything and gets to be cynical or skeptical from the outside is like, Well, what would I expect admissions professionals to say? Of course they're going to say, we've got good judgment, we're connoisseurs. How do we know, how do we know how far our trust in them should extend?
I'm going to revise what I said a little bit. Admissions professionals, to be sure, but as well, we've also asked our faculty, and they've been looking at this question closely. And I think that this question of what does success look like with respect to student outcomes, it's a great question. And of course, you can measure it in different ways: graduation rates, employment after graduation. But you also, you look at the students, are they still achieving the kinds of things that you want them to achieve? I was talking to a professor in our architecture school, and I was asking her, how do you know that you're teaching well? How do you know? Because I think we all know that student evaluations are driven mostly by almost the exact opposite factors that maybe should be considered. Instead of rigor, a lot of the student evaluations might be driven by how easy a class was and how high a grade the student got. And what she said is, obviously, don't pay as much attention to the student evaluations as much as my students continue to win all these awards based on the work that they've done in my class. And I was talking to another professor in our cinematic arts school, and they were just sharing some of the amazing things that some of our cinematic arts graduates are doing right after graduation. So I think that it's important to use metrics. It's important to be disciplined, have KPIs and all of that. But it's also, I think, important to understand or have some humility with respect to those quantitative metrics, because sometimes there are these qualitative outcomes in a lot of our schools that are just as important to keep in mind.
I want to open it up in just a couple of minutes, but we're in the Beltway. Let's talk a little bit about the inevitable kind of federal dynamics. In the fall, the administration issued its higher ed compact. You wrote a letter to the Trump administration where you noted other countries whose governments lack America's commitment to freedom and democracy have shown how academic excellence can suffer when shifting external priorities tilt the research playing field away from free meritocratic competition. Love to hear you just kind of talk about that a little bit. What do you think institutions, what do you think policymakers need to do to promote free, meritocracy and academic freedom in practice?
Right. So what I had in mind was, frankly, a lot of universities in China. We've seen really on the ascendance in terms of research productivity. They're doing an amazing job in a number of areas. And I believe, Rick, that notwithstanding those incredible achievements and the trajectory that we've seen them be on, I think there have been some articles just in the last week about the number of Chinese universities that are now in the top 10 and 20 of all research universities across the world in terms of research outcomes and productivity. I believe that they are always going to be hampered by the fact that they are producing students in a country that does not value freedom and democracy like the United States does. I think that having that environment, being in a liberal democracy, is absolutely central to academic freedom and to American universities being able to do their best work. And that's really what I had in mind. And in no way was I trying to suggest that we're becoming one of those other countries, but I wanted to just raise a little flag and say, let's be very thoughtful and careful about what we're going to be requiring, and whether it's a carrot or a stick. we can talk about that, but what we're going to be incentivizing universities to do based on what standards. And when are those standards clearly academic related, and when do those standards potentially drift into some kind of more political stream?
And obviously your background is as an attorney, and you obviously spent time at the Department of Justice. So when you think about some of the efforts that the administration has pushed, some of the changes in the reconciliation bill, are there things that you see as more positive or useful in what you're talking about, these efforts to kind of lead forward? Are there things that you find more disconcerting?
I actually believe that the administration has done a good job starting and sparking conversation about some really important issues that higher education needs to think harder about and respond to. I firmly believe that as good as some universities are with respect to open dialogue, and I count USC as one of them, there's still more that we can do to make sure that we have an environment where everyone not only tolerates different viewpoints, but wants to engage with those different viewpoints. I think that the administration raised an important question about whether it's possible to tip too heavily in favor of international student enrollment. That's a legitimate question for them to ask. I think that they've asked a completely reasonable question or set of questions about return on investment and affordability. So we actually welcome those questions. I think a lot of those questions are ultimately going to need to be answered in order for higher education to continue to thrive. And just to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, I'm really excited to tackle those questions. I think a lot of them are the right questions to be asked, and I think that USC can lead the way with respect to how we go about approaching them.
Let's go ahead and open it up. You catch the eye. Who's got the mics? Aidan and Annika. Catch their eye. Please be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. Please ask a question. If we get 15, 20 seconds in and I can't figure out where the question's going, we'll give somebody else a chance. Annika.
Hello, my name is Kai. I'm actually currently a USC student. So my question is in regards to the conversations you were having about academic rigor. And one consideration I don't think was necessarily posed is, as a student in this day and age, I increasingly feel when I'm recruiting for internships, when I'm thinking about careers, that less and less these people who are hiring, they care significantly less about the things we're doing in class and more about our extracurricular involvements. What research are we doing? What projects are we doing? And with that in mind, I feel like, although I do agree that there are definitely concerns about rigor to be addressed, I also think it's important to look at changes in academics, not just in blanket statement, let's increase rigor, but how can the changes in academic curriculum actually match the new priorities of these people who are hiring? And with that in mind, what considerations have you made in terms of when you're thinking about issues like academic rigor, keeping that in mind? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that one of the ideas I was just kind of throwing out, and I'd want to think more about it, is that perhaps part of the reason why it no longer is academic rigor seems to be as valued by employers as it used to be is because, number one, there could be grade inflation so that everyone's grades look similar, and number two, academic rigor is still based primarily or exclusively on your transcript and GPA. And I think one of the really interesting opportunities for us to think about is getting beyond just the formal traditional transcript and creating opportunities to convey to employers easily beyond just what classes did I take, what grades did I get, but what did I learn in those classes? What skills did I develop in those classes? The other thing that I think is worth thinking about, just worth thinking about, is we most universities or all universities have academic advisors, right? And I think they often have a separate set of career service resources that are not always or necessarily connected at all to the academic advising. And I think that that's a really interesting opportunity to think about. Are there ways for the academic advising to be done in parallel with or in coordination with career counseling, so that you're not just asking or having a conversation, what classes do I need to complete my major requirements, but what do all those classes add up to in terms of preparedness for the kind of career that I want to have? So those are just a couple thoughts, and I think you'll be hearing more about both of those in the months to come.
And
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jackson. I'm from Booz Allen Hamilton. And I had a quick question about something you alluded to in regards to the incentive structure for professors on promotions and status within the field. So most professors realize that if they don't get a certain number of peer-reviewed publications, then promotions and tenure might go out the window. And when we're talking about free and open inquiry, I think it's fantastic to talk about the culture of students in the classroom, but also in the research process. And many professors, from my perception, won't start on a project unless they're pretty sure that it will get published, because it just takes so much time. It's just an opportunity cost. So I was curious if you could talk about the influence that academic journals have on universities and the research process as a whole, and if you think there's alternative ways to measure the success of a research university. Thank you.
Wow, this is, we could do an hour on this one. So I think that there's been some soul searching over the years around journals, and frankly, the number of journals that we have and the quality control around some of these journals, the issue of not being able to replicate research findings when other people try to replicate research they've seen in some of these journals, issues of plagiarism and falsification. So, there's a lot there that I just mentioned, but I think that we really kind of probably need to take a hard look at some of these issues that I just mentioned, and not just kind of propagate a culture or a system where it's just the number of journals, articles, that you've published in journals that count, but that there's a more qualitative assessment. And I'm not suggesting that there's not a clear difference between Science and Nature and some other journal. There is, but I think that we've seen issues in terms of not being able to replicate results plaguing journals of all kind of rank and quality. So that's something I think that we need to take a close look at. The other thing that I was thinking about when you were asking your question is that there's so much, the way to get published in a journal, right, is typically by producing experiment that, doing an experiment that actually produces some interesting or positive outcome. And of course, we know that science depends just as much on all the failed experiments, all the experiments that don't work out. And something I worry about is just the amount of energy and time that people are spending on experiments and research that others have already determined are not going to produce any kind of results. But they don't know that because there's no journal of failed experiments or failed research out there. But I think that thinking about how to really destigmatize failure, to go to the first point in your question, is really important, because sometimes those failed experiments are just as important in the long term in terms of producing scientific value and creating progress. So anyway, a lot in your question, and more to come on that. But I'm glad that you're seeing more and more attention on this question of retractions. And there's a college classmate of mine, Ivan Oransky, who I think has a journal that studies retractions, and it's a really interesting idea and worth looking further at.
On a related piece of this is obviously what you're talking about here is the experimental sciences.
Yeah.
But there's also a sense that journals are driving scholarly behavior in the humanities, in the social sciences, even for folks who are not doing experimental or even quasi-experimental work. And it can feel, there's 25,000 journals. A century ago, there were 100. Back then, they played this crucial role in disseminating information. Today, it feels much more, I worry that it's much more a tail wagging the dog phenomena, that the point of being a literature professor at a place like USC or an anthropologist seems to be much more defined by the ability to mentor and teach than by, and yet, in terms of professional incentives, in terms of tenure and promotion standards, it looks very similar, I think, in most institutions to folks who are working in experimental fields.
Going back to the subject of how do you incentivize great teaching, and going back to your question, at a major research university, the way you get tenure, right, is typically through research. Could major research universities think about a tenure track for faculty who teach? I'm not advocating that right now, but I think it's a question that might be interesting to ask and consider.
Although, right, traditionally those professors of practice then become second-class citizens at the institutions.
But but it could help, though, in terms of bridging that kind of divide.
Or if we understood that publication standards ought to be thought about differently by field and by methodology. Annika, buddy. Aidan, I think we'll make this the last question.
Hello, Alex Blinkoff with the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. So you inherited a over $200 million budget deficit when you came in as president and had to fire quite a number of employees. I think around 1,000 was the number I saw in the LA Times. You obviously have had a lot of time to think about the difficult financial situation and the difficult political situation that your university is in. How do you reconcile, how do you navigate trying to make changes and implementations of new ideas to, like, for example, promote intellectual diversity on campus, which all these things invariably cost money? How can you do that while also navigating such a challenging financial status?
So the steps that I was describing, including the layoffs that you referenced, they have been incredibly effective in right-sizing our operating model. And we're now actually, for this current fiscal year that we're in, that will end at the end of June, projected to actually be generating a significant margin. And that should continue in the years ahead. So it was really difficult. It was painful for our entire community. I appreciate you're giving me the credit, but in fact, the decisions over how to reduce the workforce was made in collaboration with the entire academic leadership of the university. And I had a few principles that, as the leader, I said I wanted us to follow. Number one, I only wanted to do it once, if possible. In other words, I didn't want to do something that was drip, drip, drip and incremental. I wanted to just face up to the entire challenge, the research issues, enrollment issues, structural deficit issues, and really try to address it in one fell swoop. And secondly, I wanted to do it in a way that would protect and actually strengthen the academic mission in the long run. And I'm really incredibly impressed by my community and the leadership with me working on this with me, that they were able to pull it off in a way that we're really in a very different kind of financial position. And we're going to now have, there's still going to be challenges, don't get me wrong, but I think that we absolutely feel like we're back in a position where we can continue to reinvest in all of the research and all of the academic excellence, all of the things that we've talked about during this conversation that really define USC and make us the great institution we are.
Beong, we didn't get a chance to talk major NCAA sports, which I think there's a lot of interesting questions, but we covered a lot of the rest. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you.
Thanks all of you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great afternoon.